Some messages shouldn't be sent. Others change everything. There are messages we type out of distraction, others on impulse. And then there are those we write after spending too much time being too small, too silent, and too obedient for a world that never reciprocated that effort. This is the story of one of those messages. Short, reckless, sent at the wrong time, but powerful enough to cross an entire city and arrive straight at the door of the man who, until then, represented everything she should never have wanted. For years, she did everything right. She worked hard, followed rules, maintained boundaries, suppressed her feelings, and convinced herself that security was synonymous with happiness. She was the perfect employee, the discreet woman, an almost invisible presence in the places she frequented. No one feared her. No one openly desired her. And above all, no one expected anything from her beyond the basics. And perhaps that was the biggest mistake of all, spending her entire life believing that not being seen was a virtue. On the other side of this story was a man who never went unnoticed, a name that silenced conversations, a gaze that made adults rethink their words, a power that didn't need to be announced. Officially, he was just a respected businessman. Unofficially, he was someone who didn't get where he was without leaving his mark along the way. He was the kind of man who didn't chase after anything, much less someone like her. At least that's what made sense. Until it stopped. That night, there were no plans, no calculated seduction, no clear intention. There was only exhaustion. An accumulated exhaustion from someone who had spent too much time holding back, internally explaining why they couldn't want more, why they shouldn't feel that way, why they needed to continue being proper. Between a banal conversation, one more drink than usual, and a cell phone vibrating with a work message, something broke. And when something breaks after years under pressure, it doesn't break delicately. She typed only 3 words. No promises, no explanations, no guarantees. Come and get me. She thought she would delete it. She didn't. She thought she would regret it in time. There wasn't time. And when she realized what she had done, it no longer mattered, because what seemed like just an inconvenient message had turned into the beginning of something neither of them could pretend didn't exist. 10 minutes later, he was at her door. And in that instant, everything she had been until then began, silently, to fade away. The art of being invisible. Helena learned early on that existing in silence was a valuable skill. While others competed for attention, she honed the opposite talent, going unnoticed. It wasn't a lack of intelligence, beauty, or ambition. It was survival. Helena spoke only when necessary, occupied little space, always sat in corners, and had an almost professional gift for not being remembered soon after leaving a room. She grew up hearing that she was too shy, too reserved, too careful, and she accepted all of this as if it were an instruction manual for living without conflict. Inside her own shell, as some called it, the world was predictable, and predictability, for her, always meant security. This characteristic made her an exemplary employee. In 11 months working as an executive assistant, Helena never missed a deadline, never mixed up a schedule, and never needed her name to be called out loud for her work to be noticed. She arrived before everyone else, left after most, and mastered details that went unnoticed even by the most experienced directors. She was organized, efficient, and emotionally economical. She didn't get involved in gossip, didn't create unnecessary alliances, and never confused work with intimacy. To many, she was just the assistant. To those who truly paid attention, she was the silent cog that kept everything running. Working for Victor Romano demanded exactly that kind of person. Victor didn't tolerate noise. He disliked emotional improvisations, nor people who needed constant validation. He was the type of man who could walk into a room and change the atmosphere without saying a word. Tall, with a firm posture, his gaze too direct for anyone who had something to hide. Officially, he ran a logistics company with international operations. Unofficially, there were unrecorded meetings, phone calls in other languages, and decisions that never appeared in the final reports. Helena saw it all, and, as always, pretended not to see anything. Victor was impeccably professional with her, polite, precise, and just the right amount of distance. He remembered how she drank her coffee, noticed when she was exhausted, and never asked personal questions. He never crossed a line, never confused authority with intimacy. And perhaps for that very reason, Helena harbored a feeling she classified as inappropriate, silent, and utterly untenable. It wasn't declared passion nor explicit fantasy. It was something more dangerous: constant attention, an excessive awareness of his presence, an involuntary acceleration whenever he pronounced her name with that controlled calm. She never thought of acting on it. Helena didn't act. She organized, anticipated, controlled. Her feelings were treated like confidential files, cataloged, stored, and never accessed without authorization. Liking her own boss, especially someone like Victor, was a serious violation of all the rules she had always followed. And so, day after day, she continued to be the perfect assistant, the invisible woman, the irreproachable professional, convinced that some desires simply weren't meant to be touched, at least until the night it all stopped working. The man who never asked for anything. Victor Romano wasn't the type of man who needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. His authority didn't come from fiery speeches or theatrical gestures, but from an almost disconcerting calm. He spoke little, listened more than he let on, and had a habit of looking people in the eye long enough to make them reconsider poorly constructed lies. In the office, everyone knew when Victor was in a good mood, and especially when he wasn't, even if he showed nothing more than a slight adjustment in his tone of voice or a longer silence. Helena observed all this from a distance, with the attention of someone who learns to survive by reading the atmosphere before any word is spoken. Despite his intimidating aura, Victor never crossed any boundaries with her. There were no misplaced compliments, innuendos, or undue intimacy. He treated her with an almost clinical respect, as if deliberately avoiding any gray area between command and closeness. It was a carefulness that, paradoxically, made everything more difficult. Because while other men confused power with abuse of attention, Victor did the exact opposite. He maintained the correct distance, spoke only when necessary, and never gave Helena a legitimate reason to distrust his intentions. This made him more dangerous than any direct approach ever could be. Helena, for her part, had become an expert at interpreting small gestures. She could tell when Victor was tense by the way he closed his briefcase, when he was satisfied by the relaxed silence after a difficult meeting. He remembered minute details: the coffee made exactly the right way, the specific organization of the files, the way she preferred to receive instructions in writing rather than verbal improvisations. These details weren't romantic in themselves, but they created a constant field of awareness, as if he were always present even when he wasn't physically around. For someone who had spent her entire life feeling invisible, this was both comforting and deeply unsettling. She sometimes wondered if Victor noticed. Not her feelings. She was sure he had never given any indication of that, but that silent tension that always arose when they shared the same space for too long. Helena never blushed, never stumbled over her words, never asked personal questions. Her emotional discipline was impeccable. Still, there were moments when she felt his gaze linger on her for a second longer than strictly necessary, as if he were assessing something not included in any report. At those times, she focused even more on her work, as if efficiency could act as armor. Victor also had his own rules, rigid, unwritten rules, that included never mixing business with desires, and never using his position to create any kind of emotional dependency. He knew too many stories, too many ugly endings to feign innocence about the power he wielded. If he felt something for Helena, and that didn't yet have a clear name even for him, he treated it as just another thing that needed to be kept under control. After all, Desire was easy. What was difficult was continuing to be the man he had forced himself to be. And for 11 whole months, they both did exactly that. They controlled everything. Until the day the control simply became exhausting. The voice that said what she avoided hearing. The only person capable of disrupting Helena's carefully constructed equilibrium was Clara. They had known each other since college, long enough for Clara to have memorized all of her friends' emotional defenses, and even worse, to know exactly where to poke to bring them down. Clara didn't believe in overly organized lives, nor in women who called solitude tranquility. To her, Helena wasn't reserved, she was restrained. And that night, sitting across from her in a discreet restaurant, with glasses being slowly refilled, Clara decided she had been patient enough. While Helena talked about work, deadlines, and commitments, Clara watched her as if witnessing someone justifying a comfortable prison. There was affection in her gaze, but also impatience. When Helena commented, almost proudly, that she hadn't gone on any dates in the last few months, Clara didn't laugh. She simply tilted her head, took a deep breath, and asked the question Helena had been avoiding for years. When was the last time you did something that wasn't in your control? Helena tried to answer lightly, but quickly realized that any answer would sound empty. She liked the predictability, she said. She liked knowing exactly how her days would end. Clara called it by its correct name, fear disguised as maturity. The subject inevitably turned to work. It always did. Helena spoke of Victor with the practiced neutrality of someone repeating a speech rehearsed many times. He was demanding, brilliant, respectful. A difficult but fair boss. Clara listened in silence, mentally counting each time his name came up unnecessarily. When she pointed this out, Helena quickly denied it. There was no ulterior motive, she said. It was merely professional admiration. Clara smiled in that dangerous way of someone who doesn't believe almost anything she's just heard. Admiring someone didn't make anyone this tense. The conversation took on a more direct tone as the glasses emptied. Clara spoke of her own mistakes, poorly chosen relationships, impulsive decisions that went wrong, and others that, despite everything, were worthwhile. Helena listened attentively, but maintained emotional distance. She didn't allow herself to think about what if. What if was too unstable a territory. Clara, on the other hand, seemed to live in it naturally. It was then that she uttered the phrase that echoed in Helena's mind long after dinner was over. You spend so much time avoiding what could go wrong that you never discover what could go right. When they said goodbye, Helena returned home with an uneasy feeling of displacement. Nothing had objectively changed. Her life remained organized, safe, predictable. But something had been stirred up. Clara's words didn't sound like an attack, but like a mirror. For the first time in a long time, Helena wondered if that careful version of herself was a conscious choice, or just the result of years of avoiding risks, for fear of wanting too much. And it was in this state, not exactly drunk, but emotionally exposed, tired of holding back, that she entered the house, dropped her shoes, picked up her cell phone, and replied to a message that shouldn't have been just about work. 3 words that don't ask for permission. Helena had always believed that the home environment was where control returned to its place. The small apartment, too organized for someone her age, functioned as an extension of her mind. Nothing out of place, nothing unexpected. She took off her shoes, changed into comfortable clothes, and tried to convince her body that this night would end like all the others. A light movie, a harmless distraction, silence as a reliable companion. The problem is that, when the mind starts asking questions that were never allowed, no routine is enough to silence them completely. The cell phone vibrated on the kitchen table. A message from Victor. Short. To the point. Professional. He was asking about a document he needed for the next morning. Nothing out of the ordinary. Helena picked up the phone with the automatic intention of replying as always. Precise. Polite. Correct. She typed the reply, reviewed it, mentally confirmed it was adequate, and then stopped. Deleted it. Not because it was wrong, but because, suddenly, she felt a profound weariness of the role she had flawlessly played for months. The message flashed on the screen as a reminder of everything she was, and everything she never allowed herself to be. She tried to rationalize. She told herself it was just a difficult night, that Clara had exaggerated, that the discomfort would pass. But while she was thinking, her fingers moved with an autonomy they didn't usually possess. There was no planning. There was no strategic reflection. There was only a raw, almost childlike impulse to stop being predictable for a few seconds. 3 words appeared on the screen, too simple for the damage they would cause. When Helena realized what she had written, her thumb was already pressing the send button as if it had a will of its own. Regret came immediately. Not elegantly, nor discreetly. It came like a physical impact, a sudden acceleration of the heart, a heat rising to her face. She tried to correct, explain, soften. Each new message made everything more confusing. The silence on the other side of the screen seemed to scream. Helena dropped the phone on the sofa, as if it were a dangerous object, and began to walk around the apartment, trying to regain a control that no longer existed. That wasn't her. She didn't do things like that. She didn't cross invisible lines. She didn't ask, much less in that way. When her phone vibrated again, Helena didn't want to look. But she did. The reply was short. No exclamation points, no emojis, no apparent emotion. Exactly like Victor used to be. He was leaving. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't suggest alternatives. He just stated it. It was at that moment that Helena understood that she hadn't just sent an inconvenient message. She had triggered something she didn't know how to turn off. And as time began to tick by strangely fast, an uncomfortable certainty settled in. It no longer mattered if it had been a mistake. Someone was coming, and she would have to deal with it awake, conscious, and completely out of the script she had written for herself her whole life. 10 minutes is not just 10 minutes. The following minutes did not pass normally. They didn't advance in a straight line. They didn't obey the clock on the wall. They didn't respect any known logic. For Helena, time began to behave like a silent enemy, sometimes running too fast, sometimes dragging cruelly. 10 minutes had never seemed so long. Each second amplified her awareness of her own body, of the apartment that was too small, of the clothes that were too comfortable, of the irreversible decision she had just made without asking permission, not even from herself. For the first time in years, she didn't know exactly what to do, and that left her on the verge of panic. She tried to organize the space as if organization could reverse decisions. She gathered glasses, aligned cushions, pushed chairs. Everything seemed inadequate. She thought about changing her clothes, but any choice seemed wrong. If she dressed up too much, it would seem calculated. If she stayed as she was, she would seem careless. She walked to the bathroom mirror and stared at herself with an expression she barely recognized. There was no visible lack of control, nor exaggeration. There was only a woman who, for a few minutes, didn't know which version of herself she needed to present. The impeccable professional or the real person who never left the background. The thought of pretending she wasn't home crossed her mind like a belated lifeline. She could claim she'd fallen asleep, that the phone was on silent, that it had all been a misunderstanding. But that alternative required a coldness she no longer possessed. The problem with acting on impulse is that, afterward, any retreat seems like cowardice. And Helena didn't want to be brave. She just didn't want to hide again. Not this time. Not after asking. When the doorbell rang, there was no shock. There was confirmation. The sound echoed through the apartment like a soft, yet definitive sentence. Her heart pounded too hard for the silence of the place. She walked to the door with steps that didn't seem her own, feeling the weight of each movement, each breath, each thought that tried to anticipate what was to come. On the other side was a man who had always existed in another context, in another setting. Not there, not at that time, not for that reason. Upon opening the door, Helena immediately understood that none of this fit the rules she knew. Victor wasn't protected by formalities, nor shielded by distance. He was there like someone who answered a call, simple as that. His gaze swept across the room with controlled speed and returned to her with complete attention. There was no disapproval, no exaggerated surprise, just presence. And in that silent, wordless moment, Helena had the strange certainty that those 10 minutes hadn't been just a physical journey through the city. They had been the definitive crossing between who she had always been and who she was about to discover she could be, when silence changes its meaning. The first minute after Victor entered the apartment was strange in an almost awkward way. There was no urgency, no rush to fill the space with words. They were used to talking about deadlines, contracts, numbers, and objective decisions. Suddenly, there was no agenda, no schedule, no professional context to hide behind. Helena realized that the silence wasn't empty. It was charged. Every gesture seemed amplified, every breath more audible, as if the environment demanded total attention to what was happening there, at that exact moment. Victor was the first to speak, but not in the way she expected. He didn't ask if she was all right, nor did he justify his hasty arrival. He simply stated, with a calmness bordering on disconcerting, that he was there because she had asked him to be. The sentence was simple, almost obvious, but it carried a different weight outside the office. Helena tried to explain, stumbling over words that rarely failed her. She spoke too much, corrected herself, mixed reason with nervousness. It was clear that this was not the woman he knew in the company corridors, and that did not go unnoticed. Victor listened to everything without interrupting. There was no judgment on his face, nor impatience. When he finally responded, he made clear something Helena hadn't expected to hear. She wasn't in trouble. There was no scolding, no immediate consequence, no lecture on professional boundaries. Curiously, this disarmed her more than any reprimand would have. For the first time, she wasn't trying to defend herself from something concrete, only dealing with her own exposure. And that was infinitely more difficult for someone who had spent her entire life protecting herself efficiently and silently. The conversation proceeded cautiously, as if both were treading on ground too unstable for abrupt movements. Victor spoke little, but each word seemed precisely chosen. He said he needed to understand what that message meant, not as a boss, but as a man. Helena felt the impact of this distinction. For the first time, he was explicitly separating the roles that had always kept them safe. She tried to hide behind rational explanations, but realized she had already gone too far to feign neutrality. There was something there that could no longer be treated as a technical error. When Victor moved a little closer, not invasively but close enough to reduce the space between them, Helena felt her body react before her mind. It wasn't fear, nor exactly desire. It was recognition. A silent understanding that this version of herself, less controlled and more honest, had been seen. And, perhaps most disturbing of all, she had been accepted. In that instant, Helena understood that what was happening wasn't the result of a poorly thought-out message, but the sum of months of restraint, avoided glances, and archived feelings. And once something like that comes to the surface, there's no pretending it doesn't exist. The silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was decisive. The moment when pretending becomes pointless. There was a point, Helena realized, where explanations ceased to serve their purpose. She was still trying to organize sentences to justify the unjustifiable when Victor did something simple and devastating. He said he needed to know what she really wanted, not what seemed appropriate, nor what would sound professional the next day, but what was behind that message sent without calculation. The question didn't come with pressure, nor with explicit expectation. It came with an almost uncomfortable honesty, as if he were offering her the chance to choose without pushing her in any direction. For someone accustomed to reacting to circumstances, that freedom was frightening. Helena felt the old urge to downplay everything, to say it had just been tiredness, external influence, an isolated mistake. But every time she tried to go down that road, something inside her resisted. She had spent too much time reducing feelings to footnotes to continue pretending now. The silence stretched on as she struggled with her own tendency to hide. And then, almost like a reluctant confession, she admitted that she had thought about him more often than she should have, that she felt something that didn't fit into any rule she knew, and that message had been less about losing control and more about ceasing to hold back. Victor didn't react immediately. He observed her with an unusual level of attention, as if he were seeing someone who had always been there, but never fully visible. When he responded, it was with a frankness Helena hadn't expected. He said he had also noticed things over the months: small gestures, specific silences, a constant tension that didn't align with simple professionalism. He admitted that he had chosen not to act, not because he didn't feel anything, but because he didn't want to be the kind of man who confuses position with permission. That revelation shifted the weight of the conversation. Suddenly, Helena was no longer alone in the exhibition. The closeness between them ceased to be merely physical. It became emotional, almost inevitable. Victor spoke of control, the kind of control he exercised every day, at work and outside of it, and of how this specific situation defied any planning. He said that if he was there, it was because he wanted to be. Not out of obligation, not out of blind impulse, but by choice. Helena felt the impact of these words more strongly than she had imagined. For the first time, someone too powerful to need to prove anything was choosing not to run away from it. When the space between them finally decreased, there was no urgency or dramatization. It was a careful, almost respectful movement, as if both knew they were crossing an invisible boundary that wouldn't allow for a simple return. Helena didn't think about the office, the rules, or the next day. She only thought about how tired she was of living as if desire were a character flaw, and in that instant, by allowing the closeness to exist without excuses, she understood that the control she had always valued wasn't being lost. It was being replaced by something rarer: the courage to acknowledge what she felt. What happened next wasn't a thoughtless outburst, nor an impulsive gesture without consequence. It was the silent realization that some truths, when finally spoken, make any pretense untenable. Helena knew that nothing would be simple from then on. She knew she would have to deal with choices, redefined boundaries, and difficult conversations. But she also knew that, for the first time, she wasn't reacting to the world. She was participating in it. And that realization, more than any gesture, marked the point of no return that night. The rules that nobody writes. After the silence returned, it no longer carried the weight of the initial tension. It was a different kind of silence, almost organized, as if they were both trying to understand exactly where they had arrived. Helena felt an immediate need to put something in order, not the apartment, nor the appearance, but the situation. She had spent her entire life believing that feelings needed to be controlled with the same efficiency as a corporate agenda. Now, faced with something that didn't fit into mental spreadsheets, she realized that improvising was also a form of responsibility. It wasn't enough to feel. It was necessary to decide. Victor was the one who gave shape to what was still vague. He said, with the same clarity with which he conducted difficult meetings, that this could only continue if it was treated seriously. No games, no confusing secrets, no gray areas between command and desire. At work, everything would remain exactly as it always had been: professional, detached, impeccable. Outside of work, if there was something to explore, it would be with honesty and conscious choice. There were no promises, no exaggerated romanticization. There was an implicit agreement between two adults who knew they were dealing with something too delicate to be treated impulsively. Helena listened attentively, feeling an unexpected relief. Part of her feared that this moment would end up being a mistake, difficult to correct. The other, quieter part feared that it would disappear as quickly as it had appeared. Victor's words, however, offered neither an easy escape nor empty excitement. They offered structure. And for someone who had always needed structure to feel safe, that made more sense than any grand declaration. For the first time, desire didn't seem synonymous with loss of control. They talked about boundaries like someone redrawing a map, not to restrict, but to avoid getting lost. Helena spoke of her fear of being reduced to something less in the workplace, of having her competence questioned, of losing the identity she had painstakingly built. Victor listened without interrupting and responded with something simple, yet firm. Nothing she had achieved would be jeopardized by him. If at any point it threatened her integrity, it would be the end. No drama, no bargaining. That statement, more than any romantic promise, was what made her believe that this wasn't a disguised trap. When Victor stood up to leave, there was no hurry or regret in the gesture. He didn't try to prolong the moment beyond what was necessary, nor did he leave any doubts hanging in the air to fuel confused expectations. Before leaving, he simply said they would talk again when everything was clear, with their heads in the right place, and their emotions settled. Helena was alone in the apartment after the door closed, feeling something new occupy the space where before there had only been control. The feeling that, for the first time, she wasn't hiding behind rules. She was choosing which rules made sense to follow. And this choice, silent and conscious, was the true beginning of everything. The morning when nothing could be faked. The following morning arrived unceremoniously, like all the others, but Helen awoke with the uneasy feeling that something essential had been displaced during the night. There was no dramatic hangover or theatrical regret, just an uncomfortable lucidity, the kind that appears when the body rests, but the mind insists on reviewing every detail. The apartment was too quiet, too organized, as if trying to deny that something off-script had happened there. Helena sat on the bed for a few minutes, staring at the floor, aware that she couldn't simply classify the previous night as a mistake and move on as she always did. It had weight, and things with weight don't disappear on their own. The cell phone on the table seemed like a neutral object, but Helena knew it wasn't. There was a message waiting. Short, polite, direct. Victor asked how she was, with the naturalness of someone who respects space but doesn't back down. Helena read the message more than once before replying. She considered the alternatives. She could downplay it, she could cool off, she could return to a strictly professional tone and pretend it had all been a misunderstanding. The curious thing is that this option, which had always been the most comfortable, now seemed strangely cowardly. For the first time, running away required more effort than staying. She answered with restrained honesty. She said she was fine, a little confused but lucid. She didn't try to be witty or distant, just real. The answer came too quickly to be casual. Victor said he'd like to see her later, to talk calmly, outside of any work context. It wasn't an impulsive invitation, nor a demand. It was a logical continuation of what had already been started. Helena realized that this was the real choice. Not the message from the previous night, but the conscious decision made in broad daylight. The rest of the morning passed in a state of heightened awareness. Helena made coffee, organized tasks, tried to distract herself with small routines, but everything seemed permeated by a central question. Did she really want to go ahead? Without the veneer of impulsiveness, without the alibi of tiredness, without external excuses. The answer didn't come in the form of exaggerated enthusiasm, nor paralyzing fear. It came as a quiet certainty, almost uncomfortable in its clarity. She was tired of being just the confident version of herself. She didn't want reckless adventure. She wanted presence, choice, truth. When the time for the arranged meeting arrived, Helena prepared herself without drama. She chose simple clothes, but ones that made her feel grown up, not hidden. She didn't try to be someone else. She didn't try to impress. For the first time, she wasn't entering into something to please external expectations. She was there to confirm something within herself. As she left home, she had the distinct feeling that this decision, made in silence, without witnesses, was more courageous than any impulsive gesture of the previous night. And as she walked towards what was to come, Helena understood that she wasn't blindly crossing a risk. She was, finally, embracing her own desire without apologizing for it. What happens when fantasy meets reality? That night's meeting was anything but impromptu, and precisely for that reason, it carried a greater weight. Helena realized this the moment she sat down at the table facing Victor, in a place too discreet to be casual and too quiet to allow distractions. There was no atmosphere of explicit seduction, nor any expectation of a predictable romantic script. What existed there was the need to align truths. Victor didn't try to soften the mood with easy humor, nor did he pretend that everything could be simple. He began by saying exactly what Helena needed to hear, that this wasn't a game, and that, if they continued, there would be consequences. Victor spoke of the world he lived in with the same objectivity with which he spoke of business. He didn't present himself as a villain or a hero, simply as someone who had made difficult choices and carried responsibilities that didn't fit into romantic narratives. He said that his position carried risks, not only professional but personal, and that anyone associated with him ended up being observed, commented on, measured. Helena listened to everything without interrupting, feeling the romanticism adjust to reality, without completely dissolving. This wasn't a warning to distance herself, but an invitation to awareness. When it was her turn to speak, Helena surprised herself with her clarity. She didn't try to deny her fear, nor did she feign excessive courage. She said she knew there were risks, that she understood what it meant to be seen as the woman beside him, in an environment where reputations are fragile. But she also said something she hadn't planned, that she was tired of living only within what seemed safe to others. She didn't want childish protection, nor empty promises. She wanted the chance to choose, knowing exactly what she was getting into, and that, for her, was maturity, not recklessness. Victor listened in silence, his eyes attentive, as if evaluating not only the words, but the firmness behind them. When he responded, he made it clear that he would not allow her to be reduced to a mere detail of his own story. If they moved forward, it would be with clear rules, public respect, and defined boundaries. No humiliating hiding places, no power games. He didn't need someone vulnerable by his side. He needed someone who remained whole. Helena felt the weight of this declaration as something solid, not seductive. For the first time, desire came accompanied by dignity. At the end of the meeting, there were no exaggerated promises or impulsive decisions. Just a silent agreement to continue, knowing that the path would not be comfortable or simple. When they said goodbye, Helena walked home with a strange sense of tranquility. She wasn't euphoric, nor overly frightened. She was aware, and she understood with an almost frightening clarity, that this choice, made soberly, informed, and without excessive romanticization, was far more powerful than any message sent on impulse. What had begun as a confused request was now becoming a real decision. And real decisions change everything. When everything seems the same, but nothing is. The following Monday, the office woke up as usual. The same cold lights, the same overly strong coffee, the same calculated silence before the official start of the workday. For everyone else, nothing had changed. For Helena, everything seemed slightly out of place, as if the world had been rotated a few degrees to the right over the weekend. She arrived at her usual time, organized Victor's schedule, answered emails, and prepared for meetings with her usual efficiency. Outwardly, she was the same invisible and competent woman. Inwardly, every gesture carried a new awareness. Now she knew exactly what lay behind the neutrality they both displayed. Victor entered the office with the same controlled posture, the same impeccable suit, the same silent authority. He greeted Helena with a simple, "Good morning," in the exact tone he always used. No lingering gaze, no suspicious inflection. To any attentive observer, that dynamic was definitive proof that nothing had happened. But Helena noticed subtle nuances, the precise timing of the pauses, the way he entrusted decisions to her without needing to explain everything, the confidence with which they worked together. That intellectual closeness, which had always existed, now had a subtext impossible to ignore. Maintaining professionalism required more effort than Helena had expected. Not because there were uncontrollable impulses, but because awareness alters perception. Each time their hands drew closer as they exchanged documents, each time their eyes met for a second longer than necessary, there was a silent recognition. Even so, neither of them crossed any lines. On the contrary, they seemed even more disciplined, as if mutual respect had become a sacred pact. It wasn't repression. It was a continuous choice. Outside of work, things progressed with deliberate slowness. Discreet dinners, long conversations, no rush to define labels. Victor maintained the same clarity he had demonstrated from the beginning. It would only make sense if Helena remained whole, not absorbed by his world. Helena, in turn, began to realize something she had never experienced before. She didn't need to diminish herself to fit in. She didn't need to hide to be accepted. The relationship didn't require her to abandon who she was. It only required that she not erase herself. As the weeks passed, Helena understood that the real challenge wasn't dealing with external risk, but with her own internal transformation. She hadn't become a different person. She was still reserved, careful, and organized. The difference was that now these characteristics didn't stem from fear, but from choice. She no longer hid behind efficiency. She used it as a foundation, and in realizing this, Helena understood something essential. The relationship hadn't just changed how she saw herself with Victor. It had changed how she saw herself in the world. And this, more than any romance, was the beginning of a life that finally seemed chosen. When the secret starts to weigh on you. As the weeks passed, Helena realized that keeping a secret requires a specific kind of energy. Silent, constant, exhausting. It wasn't just about being careful with words or gestures, but about constantly paying attention to what couldn't be said, to what needed to be calculated even before it existed. At work, he was still impeccable. Outside of work, he was experiencing something that didn't yet have an official name, but which already occupied too much space to be treated as something temporary. The problem wasn't hiding it from others. It was hiding from herself how much it already mattered. Victor also felt the pressure, although he dealt with it differently. Accustomed to managing risks, he treated the secret as just another variable to be controlled. But Helena began to notice subtle signs of weariness. The way he was overly attentive to other people's glances, how he interrupted conversations at inappropriate times when someone got too close, how he assessed surroundings before relaxing. That constant vigilance wasn't just external protection, it was an attempt to preserve something he clearly didn't want to lose. And that, in itself, made everything more real. The bond between them deepened in a curiously calm way. There were no dramatic outbursts, no exaggerated declarations. There was a shared routine, conversations that lasted until dawn, comfortable silences. Helena began to know parts of Victor that didn't appear in the office, the methodical way he organized his thoughts, the dry humor that arose at unexpected moments, the seriousness with which he spoke of responsibility and loyalty. He, in turn, seemed fascinated by the way Helena observed the world, how she thought before speaking, how she became more assertive as she felt secure. This wasn't an escape from reality. It was a slow construction. But secrets have an expiration date, even when well kept. Small comments began to surface in the office. Nothing direct, nothing explicit. Just curious glances, uncomfortable pauses, questions asked with excessive caution. Helena noticed this before Victor. She always noticed. She was used to reading atmospheres. And this time, the atmosphere was beginning to change. Not because of scandal, but because of suspicion. Perfection, when maintained for too long, tends to attract unwanted attention. On a particularly quiet night, Helena said aloud what she had been avoiding for days. She couldn't hide forever. She didn't want it to become something clandestine, small, reduced to empty hours. Victor listened in silence, as he always did when something was truly important. He didn't disagree. He simply said he knew that moment would come, and that, when it did, he wouldn't let her face it alone. For the first time, Helena understood that the greatest risk wasn't the world finding out. It was continuing to pretend that it could still be kept silent. And this realization marked the beginning of a new phase, much more exposed, and much more definitive. The day the silence ended. The decision to make everything visible wasn't accompanied by drama. There were no ultimatums, no rehearsed scenes, no fiery speeches. It came as mature decisions do, after much thought and few words. Victor scheduled a meeting with the leadership team for an ordinary morning, one of those that normally dealt with numbers, goals, and deadlines. Helena knew, the moment she saw the invitation on the calendar, that this would be the day. Not because someone had discovered something concrete, but because the burden of hiding was no longer sustainable. The silence, which had once protected her, now suffocated her. When everyone was gathered, Victor didn't mince words. He spoke with the same firmness he always used when making difficult decisions. He said that he and Helena were in a relationship, that it didn't interfere with their work, and that any questions about competence, ethics, or professionalism should be directed exclusively to him. He didn't ask permission. He didn't justify his feelings. He simply stated the facts. Helena remained by his side, her posture erect, her expression calm, aware that this stance was worth more than any verbal defense. For the first time, she wasn't hiding behind efficiency. She was visible by choice. The reaction in the room wasn't explosive, as Helena had feared in the most anxious scenarios she had created in her mind. There was silence, a few glances exchanged, an initial discomfort that quickly gave way to something unexpected. Normality. One of the directors, who had worked with Victor for years, commented that he had already imagined it. Another simply nodded, as if registering relevant information and moving on. The tension dissolved almost anticlimactically, and Helena realized that part of the fear came more from the anticipation of the judgment itself than from the judgment. The world rarely reacts with the intensity that the imagination creates. In the days that followed, Helena felt the real impact of the change. There were no privileges, no special treatment. On the contrary, her work began to be observed with even more attention. And she responded in the only way she knew how, by being excellent. Every task delivered with precision, every decision made with clarity, every meeting conducted with confidence. Gradually, any alternative narrative lost strength in the face of consistency. Not because Victor protected her, but because she stood on her own 2 feet. And this realization brought a new kind of confidence. Less fragile, less dependent. Helena understood then that becoming visible didn't mean becoming vulnerable in the way she had always feared. It meant taking up space. And taking up space required courage. But it also brought freedom. She no longer needed to measure every gesture for fear of being misinterpreted. She no longer needed to downplay her own presence. For the first time, she wasn't just the efficient assistant or the reserved woman. She was someone who chose to exist fully, even knowing that this implied risks. And curiously, it was on that day, when the silence ended, that Helena felt safer than she had ever been. When choosing ceases to be a risk. After everything came to light, Helena discovered that living openly required a different kind of courage. There was no longer the comfort of anonymity, nor the shield of silence. Every decision was now observed, every success validated with more attention, every mistake, even a small one, potentially magnified. Curiously, this didn't weaken her. On the contrary, for the first time she knew exactly where she stood. There were no invisible traps, no side games. The exposure, which she had always feared, brought with it an unexpected sense of stability. Nothing needed to be hidden anymore, and this freed up energy that had previously been consumed by fear. Helena's relationship with Victor also underwent a silent adjustment. Outside of work, they remained close, attentive, building something that no longer needed justifying to anyone. In the professional environment, they maintained the same firm and clear stance they had promised from the beginning. There were no lingering glances or ambiguous gestures. There was mutual respect and an intellectual partnership that was now openly acknowledged. Helena realized that this did not diminish the bond between them. On the contrary, it strengthened it. They didn't need to prove anything in secret, because what existed was solid enough to sustain distance when necessary. Over time, Helena began to notice something even more significant. People started listening to her differently. Not because she was associated with Victor, but because she herself had changed. Her voice was firmer, her decisions came with less hesitation. Her opinions were expressed without the implicit request for permission that had previously accompanied them. She hadn't become aggressive or imposing. She had become clear. And clarity, in environments where everyone competes for space, is a powerful form of authority. Victor observed this transformation with silent attention. He didn't direct it. He didn't mold it. He simply accompanied it, like someone who recognizes when another person finds their own center. In intimate moments, he would say that he had always known Helena was strong. She was just hiding behind excessive caution. She heard this without denying it, but also without romanticizing it. She knew that this strength hadn't arisen because of him. He had been the catalyst, not the origin. The origin was within her, waiting for permission to exist. And it was in this understanding that Helena found something she had never had before. Tranquility. Not that fragile peace that depends on not being seen, but the profound calm of someone who knows they can stand by their own choices. Being with Victor ceased to be an act of daring and became simply part of the life he chose to live. Not on impulse, not as an escape, not out of fear of being alone, but because, after so long diminishing herself to fit into safe places, she finally understood that true security doesn't come from hiding. It comes from remaining whole, even when the world is watching. The future that didn't need to be promised. As the months passed, Helena realized that the future rarely arrives as a grand announcement. It settles in gradually, through shared habits, small decisions that are repeated until they become permanent. There wasn't an exact moment when she woke up and thought, "That's it." Instead, there was the gradual realization that her life had become broader, more meaningful. Not because everything was easy, but because nothing needed to be denied anymore. She worked with focus, lived with presence, and slept with the feeling that she was no longer running away from herself. Victor had also changed, albeit less visibly. He remained the controlled, strategic man, attentive to risks. But now there was something about him that Helena recognized as conscious commitment. Not grand promises, not speeches about forever, just consistent actions. He included Helena in important decisions, not out of dependence, but out of respect. The space that was once rigidly protected was now shared with discernment. For someone accustomed to controlling everything, sharing was a significant choice. And Helena didn't confuse this with privilege, she understood it as trust. Living together brought about conversations that previously seemed too distant to even consider. Not idealized plans, but real alignments, where they wanted to be, how they envisioned the balance between work and personal life, what they were willing to protect at all costs. Helena was surprised to realize she was no longer afraid of these conversations. Before, any projection of the future made her anxious, as if committing meant losing options. Now, committing seemed exactly the opposite, choosing clearly instead of postponing indefinitely. In the professional environment, her position was consolidating quietly, but undeniably. Helena was no longer seen merely as efficient, but as a point of reference. People sought her out for guidance. Decisions naturally passed through her. Her opinion was considered even before being asked. She didn't need to demand space. She simply remained. And that may have been her greatest victory, proving that it was possible to grow without becoming hardened, to assert oneself without becoming someone one didn't recognize in the mirror. Helena understood then that the message sent months ago hadn't been a plea for someone to save or guide her. It had been a plea for herself, a call to emerge from her own invisibility, to experience life without apologizing for her desires. Victor responded that day by crossing the city. But the one who truly responded was her, by ceasing to hide. The future now didn't need to be promised or guaranteed. It was already being lived, one day at a time, with conscious choices, real presence, and the tranquil certainty that, finally, she wasn't just passing through life. She was inhabiting every part of it, when asking stops being a weakness. Sometime later, Helena realized that certain memories don't lose their power with time. They gain meaning. The message that once seemed reckless, almost shameful, now came to her mind as a silent landmark, not for its content, but for what it represented. The exact moment when she stopped asking permission to exist. It wasn't the wine, nor the tiredness, nor the external influence. It was the accumulation of years diminishing until her body and mind decided, together, that enough was enough. She didn't become unrecognizable. She didn't become overly bold, nor did she lose the caution that had always been part of who she was. What changed was the origin of her choices. Before, they stemmed from the fear of making mistakes, of being judged, of wanting too much. Now, they came from awareness. Helena remained reserved, organized, attentive to detail, but she no longer hid behind these qualities. She used them as a foundation, not as a shield, and that made all the difference. Victor, for his part, never became the center of her life. He became a part of it, a man with shadows, responsibilities, and real risks, who never promised an easy path, but offered presence, clarity, and respect. He didn't save her, didn't mold her, didn't lead her. He simply responded when called upon, and stayed when he could have retreated. This, Helena learned, was rarer than any grand declaration. Over time, the phrase, "come get me," ceased to be merely an embarrassing memory of a night out of control. It became a symbol, not of dependence, but of courage, of taking responsibility for what you want, even without guarantees, of understanding that asking is not weakness when the request is honest, that crossing boundaries is not irresponsibility when you know exactly why you are crossing them. And so, Helena continued living, working, choosing, loving, not as the invisible woman who spent so much time avoiding risks, nor as someone who blindly threw herself into the unknown, but as someone who finally understood that life doesn't respond to those who hide, it responds to those who call. And when she called, on that silent night, someone came. But more importantly than that, she herself finally appeared.